Rich, we just celebrated the new year. You got any resolutions this year?
You know what? I'm pretty focused on getting my adult things in order. Like today, I actually did some car insurance stuff that I've been putting off.
Ooh.
I'm very proud of myself. And yeah, in 2025, I'm really trying to focus on being a productive adult. What about you, JJ?
I have one resolution this year. It's to not invest in a Brian Callahan offense ever again.
I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years. But there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have. And I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest. And I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro.
Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, buddy?
Doing good, man. The last time we talked, the Jets hadn't lost a game yet. I hadn't burnt all my money on best ball. I hadn't lost every season-long fantasy championship I was in. Hope sprung eternal, but here we are. New year, new me. JJ, good to see you, bud.
That's right. I like the attitude. It's sort of the, like my Jalen McMillan stance, never wrong, just early, right? Where
that's right.
I was in on Jalen McMillan this season, and I was still telling people to add him despite his 0.7 yards per route run rate, whenever the Chris Godwin injury happened. But things turned around for McMillan. The funny thing about McMillan, this is a total tangent, but the funny thing about McMillan is that one of his top comps in the ZAP model last year, and this is in the prospect guide, the late round prospect guide from last year, one of his top three comps was Amon-Ra St. Brown. And he kind of went, not to the same degree that ARSB did, but the way he produced down the stretch was very Amon-Ra St. Brown-esque. I'm really excited to see what he ends up doing, moving forward. This is not a Jalen McMillan show, but
it is now. Even from a real football perspective, when it was third and gotta have it, who did Baker go to?
That's right.
He went to our guy, Jalen. And by the way, I still don't think Liam Cohen knows that Jalen McMillan is a slot player. He still refuses to put him in the slot.
No
but he's
idea.
eating regardless.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that he can play inside out. He's not even playing the position that I thought and most projected him to play. They threw Chris Godwin in there for good. Godwin was eating before that injury, and that feels like a lifetime ago at this point. But they throw in Jalen McMillan, and he was playing the perimeter for, they had Sterling Shepard playing the slot a little bit. They moved Mike Evans inside even more frequently than Jalen McMillan. But I think those reps helped. And at the end of the day, now they're in the playoffs, and we might be able to get a little McMillan action in the playoffs, which, by the way, everybody, promo code late round on Underdog right now. There are playoff contests. You can get a nice deposit offer at the moment if you go and you play. But I've been doing some mitten drafts. I started this week. I know that I've become a best ball bro, but I did not get into the playoff contests until week 18 ended, only because of time, from a timing perspective and stuff. I needed to take a little bit of a break after the season ended. I have no time during the season. And so, the holidays happened. I just didn't really sit down, and I didn't want to join these contests having no idea what was going on. But for people who aren't aware of what's going on with some of these playoff contests, it's really fun. I've been doing the mitten $5 entries. You can max up to 150. I've been doing some mitten drafts today, and I will all week long. I don't think I'm going to max, but the drafts go quickly. So it's really easy to just kind of go with these drafts. But it's cool. It's a similar structure to what you experience if you made the playoffs in any of the contests for your season-long best ball, where in round one, you got to advance out of your pod. Then there's a new one in round two, and so on and so forth. So you want to be cognizant of a team that has a bye, like the Chiefs or the Lions, and not only stacking those teams, because you do need some production here in the first round, in the wild card round of the playoffs, so that you can then move on and then hopefully have your Lions and your Chiefs kind of enter the picture and help your lineups out. But it's really it's a crazy mind game. The playoff contests are the first couple that I did. My teams were horrific, just horrifically bad, because I didn't have the flow to it. But once you start to see how things kind of go. And you can download my rankings on the Patreon, the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. But once I saw how things kind of went, I started to get a little bit more comfortable. And it's fun to you can team stack, and you got to kind of stray away from ADP a bit in this more than usual, just because you want your teams to survive. If you draft the Buccaneers and a lot of Buccaneers and they lose this weekend, then that entry's dust, right? So there's a lot of game theory, a lot of strategy to it. It's a lot of fun. Check it out, underdogfantasy.com. Are you doing any playoff stuff?
I usually do one of those pools where you can only use a player once.
Yeah, I do that. I do that every year too. Yeah.
I have a Gridiron Gamble friend that runs one of those pools, and that's fun as well because you can only use a player once. If you save a player and their team goes busto, then you can never use that player. So yeah, a lot of fun stuff this time of year.
It's fun. And it's a little bit, those are, I found at least a little bit easier than they used to be because of the 7 teams instead of the 6. When it was 6 teams on each side, you literally ran the risk of not having a quarterback in the Super Bowl. Like if you didn't plan it right, or if there were some upsets you didn't expect. Now there's 7. I do one that's super flex, which makes it kind of insane and fun, right? Because you can, I'm generally, if it's full PPR also, so I'm generally just kind of throwing a wide receiver in there in some rounds and stuff like that. But it does make it interesting because you can play 2 quarterbacks. If for instance, the Steelers are likely going to lose this weekend, I'm knocking on wood though. I still want my team to get the W. But if they're going to lose this weekend, just throw Russell Wilson in that second super flex spot because he's probably going to score more points than, a lot of the wide receivers you would choose there. But really fun format. That is the one and done ones, but definitely check out Underdog. Check out the tournaments and the contests they got going on. But Rich, today's episode is really about the question that I've gotten relentlessly over the last month. I'm not even talking about like since the season ended. I'm talking like once December hit and more and more people were talking about best ball and their results of their best ball teams. People just kept asking, how are your teams doing? How are your teams doing? And I told them I am going to be doing a recap episode with Rich at the end of the season. I promise you I'm going to be transparent because this is a learning experience for me, right? I can say on the season long side, things went well this year, right? It was a weird year in terms of, because obviously there's a connection between season long and best ball. It's not a 1-to-1, which we'll get to, but there was it was a weird season from a running back perspective, but I preach hero RB. So I kind of play in the middle there where like, it's not necessary to fade or, to just go 0 RB. Although I did win a big industry league going 0 RB this year. Thank you, Chase Brown and Bucky Irving.
Chase Brown. I knew Chase Brown would be in there.
Yeah. Of course, Chase Brown was on it. Yeah. But yeah, it was a weird year from a running back perspective. And that's what leads me to best ball and my best ball season. We had a lot of guests come on the show, a lot of pros, best ball pros. And admittedly, and I don't think that they would hide from this, some of them had pretty poor seasons as from a best ball perspective. And my season from a best ball perspective was not very strong. I'd probably give it a 4 out of 10 if I were to rate it. I had a below average advance rate in BBM. What was interesting though is that some of my advance rates, like the big board, where I only did 51 drafts in the big board. You can max enter that. I didn't max enter that because it was kind of early on in the season. I'm probably going to this year though. My big board stuff was actually really good. I had a great advance rate. Ended up getting a finals team in the big board. Also had a mini Schnauzer, I think the 7th mini Schnauzer 7 finalist. And that I'm going to put that in my Twitter bio real quick. So, I had like the big board team. So with BBM, I'll go to BBM. With BBM, low advance rate, but we saw in week 15, a lot of the things that worked for teams from weeks 1 to 14 did not work well in week 15, aka, I think Derrick Henry had a down game, Saquon Barkley had a down game, and that obviously hurts advance rate. So for folks who don't recall or didn't play BBM, weeks 1 to 14, you try to get top 2 in your league, in your pod. That's out of 12 teams. Then you advance forward and there's a new pod that you got to get first, right? Or first, or is it first in the first? All first
in the, second,
yeah. And yeah. So you just keep getting first in these new pods. So week 15, you try to get first. Week 16, you try to get first. And then week 17 is the big 500 plus team. You need some volatility and some variation from the other lineups. Now, what was interesting is I had a below average advance rate, pretty well, like a decently well below average. I lost 7 teams, I think it was, from week 14 to 5th. So or week 13 to 14. Like I was basically at expectation. And then everything went south that final week, which kind of sucked. But what was interesting was that after week 15, I was back and I had 2 semifinal teams in BBM, which is effectively what you would expect if you max enter BBM. So I don't know. It was an interesting sort of like roller coaster that I went through with this stuff, where most of the year I was slightly, because you can check with like BBM database, props to the person who's running that, because it became like the go-to resource for all of us best ball bros. But I mean, I would share with you, Rich, every week where my advance rate was. It was hovering like the 23 to 25 range for most of the season. And then it just face planted the last week and it was awful. It was terrible. But then I got 2 semifinal teams. Those 2 semifinal teams, unfortunately, didn't hit in week 16. So I didn't get a week 17 team, but I did in the big board. That big board team was actually a little bit of a sweat going into that final game with San Francisco and Detroit. I had a Jared Goff, J-Mo, Amon-Ra St. Brown stack. If J-Mo and Jared Goff would have connected, like Jahmyr Gibbs had that long touchdown at the end of that game, if Goff and J-Mo would have connected, I would have probably been top 50 in the big board with that lineup. So it was really close. It was a fun sweat. And then the mini Schnauzer was just like a kind of a whatever team. But overall, 4 out of 10, wouldn't recommend going through what I just went through in terms of the results, but the experience, 9 out of 10. Great experience. It was a fun time.
Jahmyr Gibbs, another one of those players that he became the nuts after Montgomery got hurt, but his week 15, he only had 30 yards and a touchdown. So yeah, I'll say I only did across all best ball drafts, I did 80. And like you, I had a poor advancement rate, but then I actually had from advanced to semis, I was above weight, but my 2 semis were just absolute dust. I think of it as dead last in both of my pods. And I'm very interested to dig into specifics of things that went haywire and things that we can learn about. I have 2 things that definitely tanked me, but we'll let the people know.
Yeah, we're going to go through all that. One thing I do want to give a shout. So what was really interesting about this season, you mentioned, so we had a late round fantasy football patron, a subscriber, Coop, who had a stack. He had Gibbs in that final game going into that game against San Francisco. He ended up getting 6th place in BBM. Coop did. Props to him. He said that, and he put this in the Discord, in the late round fantasy football Discord. He said that he used the rankings and he used becoming a best ball bro, as guidance. This was his first year. He max entered, and he walked away with $240,000, which was sweet. Now, it's funny because he had a really solid advance rate. I know that, a better one than I did, much better than I did. And I was like, I talked about this with you privately throughout like the season and such. And it's kind of interesting. So the way that I handled my best ball rankings for subs and stuff was that I took my season, and I was transparent about this. I wrote about this whenever I would publish the rankings, but I would take my season long rankings and I just wrote a little formula that would translate them to be best ball rankings. Right. And, I'd eyeball it, make sure it looked good, and people could or couldn't use them. If they wanted to use them, they could use them, whatever. And what was interesting about that, this leads me into sort of the number one thing that I think went wrong for me with Best Ball Mania, is obviously in season long versus best ball on Underdog, this season especially, you're going a lot more running back heavy than you would in best ball, right? We talked about that all off season, how, the guests talked about it too, how you got to get, Hayden Winks had the 4 wide receivers through 7 rounds kind of rule of thumb. You got to go wide receiver heavy or else you felt like you were really behind at the position, right? And so, but in season long, it's a little bit different, right? It's the ADP is completely different. You're drafting running backs in different spots. And so my season long rankings were pretty generically running back heavy versus what you would see in a BBM or any other best ball draft on Underdog. And my rankings, and the formula that I used to translate my season long to best ball ended up actually being a little bit more running back heavy than what ADP suggested at Underdog. And so actually a lot of the subs like Coop ended up doing well with those rankings, but I, the person who created those rankings, strayed away from them way too much. And that's my number one lesson learned, was I had too much structure with, in particular, my BBM drafts. If I look at my other contests that I entered, where I kind of played around a little bit more, where I was kind of just getting reps and wanted to like try things out, I did better in those contests. And I asked myself why. And I think it's because I used BBM as sort of this, I put it on a pedestal and said, I don't want to waste any of these entries that I have, right? I did the live streams and I was so focused on them whenever I was doing them and all that. And I didn't mind the structure of the drafts that I when I drafted them. But in hindsight, I didn't have enough variation of the structure itself. A lot of my teams were 0 RB. A lot of my teams were hero RB. And what's really funny is that one of the things that we talked about on the last episode of this before the season started was what could tank our best ball season, right? And one of the things that I mentioned was the round 2 to round 4 running backs, right? Kyron Williams, Derrick Henry. I did make the stand that I had Derrick Henry over Kyron Williams, which I think probably ended up being a W, right? That at least that micro take was a W, but the overall me having 4% exposure to those guys was an L, was a huge L. And not only that, but a lot of the wide receivers that went in that range, the Houston guys, or Amari Cooper, who went in the 4th round pretty frequently, or a lot of these players didn't pan out. They were pretty bad. And so I think a big lesson for me is not so much, obviously this year was a very pro running back year. If you drafted heavy early round running backs, you had a great advance rate. You probably made money. You did a good job. I'm not really walking away from the season being we got to do that every single year. There's a lot to dissect. There's a lot to break down. I'm going to be doing that on the podcast throughout the offseason. But for me, it's more so being more open within the BBM, even though I have limited entries of 150, being open to really changing the structure around more than I did, right? A lot of times I was just a robot going hero or 0 RB with an elite tight end and maybe getting a quarterback in there as well early, and then just kind of going with that structure over and over again. That's kind of a losing way of approaching this, in my opinion. Now in hindsight, right? While I'm doing it, I'm like, oh, this is what we've been talking about, and this is what the pros are talking about. But a lot of the pros, Leone is almost infinite. Mike Leone, who was on the show, he was almost infamous at this point for being or for sort of flattening his exposure more than some of the other folks do. But he had a great advance rate because he changed structure up. He was cognizant to say, I'm going to get some Josh Jacobs here. I'm going to be, and so that I think was probably the biggest mistake. If I were to hone in on one high level thing, that would be the one thing.
When you talk about structure, the thing that killed me is I went high variance at the quarterback position in that I literally I think once I took more than 2 quarterbacks once. I was very married to 2 quarterback build. I was okay with the variance of if one of them goes down because I wanted to really attack running back, receiver, and tight end. Unfortunately, that comes back to bite you when one of your highest owned quarterbacks is JJ McCarthy and he shreds his ACL before the season can even start. And it's annoying because Sam Darnold did so well this year. And this might sound nutty to people out there that I think JJ McCarthy could have put together a similar season. People are going to play Captain Hindsight and say, well, Sam Darnold was great this year. And it's well, Sam Darnold, of qualifying quarterbacks since he was drafted, Sam Darnold, in terms of EPA per play, was 55 of 62 coming into this season. So it wasn't like Sam Darnold was some great player that came into the season predictively and had a great season. He was very much a product of KOC and that environment in Minnesota. And I think JJ McCarthy could have done some similar facsimile of that. So that's one thing that killed me. And the other, in the similar vein with Hero RB, is one of my favorite builds was mid-late first round to go Bijan Breece, one of those running backs as my hero, and then kind of dump RB until later. Yeah. And the teams where I got Chase Brown later, I did good. And the teams where I didn't, I had a hero RB that had a very poor season in either Bijan or Breece based on draft capital. And that kind of left me in no man's land.
Yeah, I mean, Breece especially. At least Bijan, I don't know what the advance rates were, but Breece was definitely the big L, I would assume, out of the first round. The way that they used him and his injury and all that, and the way that the Jets offense, hold your ears, cover your ears, Rich, the way the Jets offense just imploded. Yeah, I mean, it's tough if you kind of skipped over the Jacobs, Rachaad White was actually kind of had an underrated season and undervalued, he was still okay, enough. Joe Mixon obviously had a monster season. So that group and up until, you get to Kyron, Derrick Henry, you could throw Saquon and Jonathan Taylor in there too if you want to. But if you weren't overweight on those guys, you probably had a losing season, like at the end of the day. And they just so happened to be clustered the way that they did. The one thing I do want to point out, I don't think that it was a horrific process way of approaching this to approach your drafts in a 0 RB way or in that fashion, because everyone looks back at the season and they're going to say, oh, running backs were really good. These early round running backs were really good. There were a lot of really good hits late too. This was just a year of the running back period, right? Where we did have Chase Brown. We did have Chuba Hubbard. We did have even James Conner, who went pretty late in these drafts at times. Like there were some really good, Bucky Irving, obviously being another one. Like there were some really, really big hits that it was still a scenario of, did you get the right guy? And that's something that I do want to talk about though, with another point here of what I did wrong and incorrectly is being too confident in player stances. And I don't mean that as in like, obviously, you should and you can be bold, right? Like that's totally fine to be overexposed to a player that you truly, truly believe in. I think that's what makes fantasy football awesome and fun is, as much as I am a process oriented and game theory oriented analyst, player takes are important still. Like there's no doubt about it. But I do think that, there is a very big difference between, what we see in season long where you go all in on Kamani Vidal in round 13 or 14 or 15 and being able to drop him after you see what J.K. Dobbins does in the first couple weeks of the season, versus what that does in best ball. And we talked about that pretty openly on this show. We talked about Vidal in particular. And so like, I don't want to use him as, the example here necessarily, but it is a good learning and it is a good example of, player stances, understanding that there is this range of outcome where you could take a 0. And I don't think that I factored even that in enough to the point where, I look at someone like Cortland Sutton, for instance, where Sutton was someone who I'm like, oh, he doesn't really have that high of a ceiling. He's playing with a rookie quarterback. Usually these kinds of profiles just don't get like they can hit, they can exceed ADP expectation, but they usually don't hit that much, right? Well, it hit pretty hard for Cortland Sutton. Like it was a really good pick at the end of the day. But on top of that, even if it didn't go to the degree that it did, it still was a good pick. And this is what a lot of, some folks even brought this up. Some of the guests brought this up on the show that Sutton was a decent selection this year. And I don't want to say brushed it off, but I went back to my season long analysis and I'm like, this isn't the kind of profile that you really want to target and be heavily invested in. But realistically, you got to look at the floor ceiling combo and you got to look at that floor. You got to really focus on the floor more than I was. That was one of the big struggles for me, was not really separating best ball and season long enough from that perspective. But then also, Rich, I want to take that a step further and say the team element, the team perspective, the looking at an offense and saying, this is the offense that's going to blow up this year. I don't think that we should be doing that in best ball. Like I think in season long, it's fine because you can make up for that mistake. In season long, if you miss a 5th round pick, if you miss a 6th round pick, and I've written about this for a decade now, it doesn't sink your team. So if you went after Calvin Ridley, let's say, it didn't really sink your team. Not that I was really high on him in general, but like if you got him because you're like, hey, the Tennessee offense is going to be good this year because they got Brian Callahan and things are looking better. They're going to be more up tempo, whatever. And they have Will Levis who likes to chuck it down the field. If that was your stance and you drafted Calvin Ridley in season long, okay. Like he has a rough start to the year. He finished okay, but you're probably able to just pick someone up off the waiver wire and fill or someone on your bench, like a Ladd McConkey that you got a couple rounds later and just slot them in and you're fine. It's no big deal. But I don't think that there's enough reason to go heavily in investing these like unknown entities at the team level when the ceiling for those teams probably is not going to be significantly high. Like, this is what we should have had the conversation with more when we talked about the Titans a lot in the off season and during the summer was like, what are the odds? What's the chance that this Tennessee offense ends up being a top 10 offense in touchdowns per game? Like what is the real chance of that happening? And then look at the players in that offense, right? I mean, Tony Pollard had a good year, obviously. Mostly, I'd say that part of that was due to Tajay Spears being banged up throughout the season. But like, the passing attack, DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley. Look at the alternatives that were going in their ranges. You probably should have just been throwing darts at players in objectively good offenses and the JMOs of the world, right? Like, even if we didn't have a good backbone for him as a player, we knew that Detroit, or someone like George Kittle, right? We knew that those players were going to be attached to an offense that had a floor that was more than likely an 80th percentile outcome for the Titans offense. You know what I mean? And I think that is something that is more glaring in the best ball environment, because you cannot make up for that mistake. If you hit on that offense, sure. And I don't know if there was that offense, like, very clear, like Washington was one of them. Maybe you could consider like Denver, but I don't know if there was like that offense, and we might be just blanking and someone's just going to come after us and be like, you're
I
idiots.
think the only surprise offense, quote unquote, was the Carolina Panthers after Andy Dalton got into a car accident. But like,
yeah, right.
what,
Right.
how, the way we got there, the way we got to Thielen being a value, Chuba being a value, like, there was a very strange way of navigating to them being value. But yeah, I can't off the top of my head think of the surprise offense this year.
Yeah. One of the big projects I'm going to take on this year and for the draft guide and stuff is going to be looking at like, what is the true range of outcomes for these teams that are entering the season after having a year with like, 30 offensive touchdowns or 25 offensive touchdowns, something low like that, versus an offense that is consistently, like Detroit bucked any regression analysis that anyone did in terms of like scoring touchdowns this year. They're like one of 2 or 3 teams since 2011 that was able to improve upon their touchdown totals after being over 50 touchdowns in a season, or something like 3.5 touchdowns per game or something like that. So like they buck the trend, but even still, like San Francisco was still good offensively. Like, it's not like like that's the thing that really kind of haunts me to a degree. Like, we even invested in Jacksonville, which, we saw that work out with Brian Thomas, who was my number 1 exposed player in best ball, wide receiver in best ball this year. But like, I do think there is something to be said about just playing it a little conservatively in best ball in terms of the team environment, and kind of picking players off of those teams and getting high exposure to them in your individual lineups. I know it sounds so obvious, but even look at like the Cincinnati backfield. We knew, Rich, that backfield was going to be fruitful if and when one of those guys won out, right? And we hitched our wagon. Like, we ended up going with Chase Brown as our, our more of our go-to. I still got some Zach Moss, don't get me wrong, but like, what if we were just bolder with that like idea and that notion, and instead of being at 18% Chase Brown, we were at 25% Chase Brown? That's the kind of stuff that I think the people who have done this a while kind of just inherently know and don't vocalize enough, because in season long, you can get away with trying to find that team. It's not that big of a deal, because when you do find that team, you're going to get a league winner, period. And it's going to obviously help in best ball too, but there's a lot more risk associated with trying to guess who that team is.
I mean, speaking of Cincinnati, you just look at Saturday night. Khalil Herbert basically comes off the couch and gets 20 carries and 8 targets.
Right.
Like, absolutely gets fed. I'm looking at touchdowns per game. The only team that is a surprise, maybe, is Tampa 4th. They had
that was a
3.
surprise for me. Yeah, I mean, it was all ripe. It's Evans, it's Godwin, like right.
Cade Otton is a tight end we're okay with, and Baker's gonna put the ball down the field. Like,
yeah, I think though, I think it goes back to what I was like, what I really want to study this offseason is injecting our subjectivity and our vibes to these teams versus just saying like, were they good last year in terms of touchdowns per game? What does that look like year over year when there aren't certain changes going on in the offense, right? Like, we didn't know what Liam Cohen was going to be like. We didn't know that he was a god as an offensive coordinator, right? Like, we didn't know that this was going to happen. And, I did send a tweet out, showing that I had like 8% Bucky this year in best ball in my BBM portfolio right before the season started, and 4% Rashad White. And I went on a journey with Bucky Irving to the point where like my prospect model didn't like him. I wasn't that into him. And then the offseason starts to happen. The summer starts to happen. He's getting some hype. And I'm like, I guess I got to throw some darts here. So I at least was at market with Bucky Irving. But like, yeah, I think Tampa Bay is probably the team that if you hit on that team. I mean, Godwin was approaching, amazing godlike numbers, for him this year before the injury happened. I just think that if you're able to play it more conservative and have your player takes within the scope of those teams, and then just wait for the later rounds to throw those darts at those other guys, probably logical. Now, obviously, ADP is going to correlate with this, and like better teams are going to have players getting drafted earlier, but there was no reason in hindsight to even be remotely drafting Amari Cooper, right? Like I was optimistic about the Browns offense passing attack because Ken Dorsey was a pass heavy coordinator, which we saw happen. Like, look at what happened when Jameis Winston took over. I don't feel bad about that take and that stance. I feel bad that the Deshaun Watson stuff was very much more a season long stance than a best ball stance, right? Like that's the problem, is that you can make up like someone on Reddit made fun of me for liking Deshaun Watson this past season in my draft guide. And I'm like, why would you not? It doesn't matter. It's free. It's a last round pick. And if he doesn't pan out, it literally doesn't matter, right? Best ball, it does. It matters a lot. And that was you make way too many assumptions. This is another thing I do want to get to, the last point. It's so easy to make assumptions with how you think a season and a team is going, like how a season's going to go down and how a team is going to use their players and deploy their players. Deshaun Watson's a great example of that. Maybe he would have started the whole year. Okay. But when a dude's bad and you have to recognize, like I knew in his range of outcomes, it could have gone that way. When a dude is that bad, you got to recognize that it could be that bad and it's going to impact everyone else on that team. Right. Now, fortunately, I had a lot of Jerry Jeudy because of Deshaun Watson, and he popped off at the right time for everybody. But, except the playoffs whenever Jameis Winston got benched. But, there's just a lot of nuance to all of that. But one of the things, and this last point that I want to make, I think that we can't make assumptions either about what we think things are going to look like from a player perspective, individual player perspective, in weeks 14, 15, and 16, and 17, and so on, the latter parts of the season versus where we're at the beginning of the season. Best example of this, Rich, the Panthers backfield. Okay. Chuba Hubbard was fine in season long, in my opinion, as a draft pick, because if you went 0 RB, you knew you were going to get some production from him to start the season. In best ball, I largely faded Chuba. I think out of my 150 best ball Mania teams, I had 2 Chuba Hubbard teams, which I'm saying that on a podcast to thousands of people, and you guys can all laugh at me and call me an idiot. It was a mistake. It was a massive, massive mistake. My season long teams, I didn't do that. My best ball teams, I did. And I'm out here drafting Jonathan Brooks in the 8th round, around guys like James Conner because of what we could see towards the end of the year. What I think we need to do is just look at different archetypes instead of looking at the individual teams and the players playing those teams. So what I mean is throw darts in the later rounds at rookie wide receivers. I think that's still fine, because in the second half of the season, when you get into the playoffs and these best ball contests, if one of these guys pops off, which we see rookie wide receivers do pretty frequently, Jalen McMillan being a good example this year, that's a huge advantage that you're going to have if your portfolio has a decent number of those guys. Don't go crazy with those types of players in the latter rounds of your draft, because you're not going to get any production from them for most of the season, if at all, right? Because the hit rates aren't going to be super, super strong. But when they do hit, it is strong. So sprinkle those guys in. But when it comes to saying this running back and this backfield is going to go this exact way, therefore I'm going to have this insane exposure differential between the two, that was a really, really big mistake. That was probably, from a player take standpoint, the biggest reason why my best ball teams weren't strong this year.
Yeah, I think one of the real killers on my rosters in terms of taking zeros were some of the rookie receivers that you briefly alluded to. Like right after the middle class elite rookie receiver cliff.
Yeah.
I mean, it just Jalen Polk, Jerome Baker, Jermaine Burton, Troy Franklin, RIP. These guys absolutely tanked it. So here are receivers you could have taken after Jermaine Burton. One last snapshot I took was pick 182 was Jermaine Burton. After him, some of these are sexier than others. Quentin Johnston, Jalen Naylor, Alec Pierce, Elijah Moore, Cedric Tillman, Jawan Jennings. You laugh, but Alan Lazard was absolutely cooking before his abdominal injury. And then the guy who crushed it at the end of the season, Olamide Zacchaeus. So some of these guys who we know they have a role, they've proven to us that they're functional professional football players, that they can go out and command targets and make use of them. Some of them fell to the wayside because we were so enamored by these mystery box items that didn't have the pedigree of a Ladd McConkey, that didn't have the pedigree of a Jalen McMillan, right? Like we fell in love with these guys, and sometimes you just got to click the olds in this part of the draft.
I think it goes back to what I was saying too, where like I this year I haven't done the analysis and run the analysis, but I do think that I would imagine that rookie wide receivers late, because there weren't many good day 3 rookie wide receivers. I mean, I can't even think of one off the top of my head that, broke out and did like well, right? And so because of that, we had a down year more than likely for late round rookie wide receivers. With that being said, there's such a volatile pick. It could go really well. It could go really south. But I don't think, after going through this experience of becoming a best ball bro, I don't think that season-long volatility is necessarily something that you need to embrace all the time in best ball.
Right.
I think
these zeros, man, they just tank you. You look at your roster, it's week 13, you're like, oh, I need to outscore this guy by 30 points, but I have this guy who it's literally, and he's not even hurt, but this human being has no chance of giving me any points.
Right. Zero. Yeah. Yeah. At least there's hope if you got Alec Pierce or something. I mean, to be fair, maybe Pierce isn't the best, because we thought that Adonai Mitchell would have a bigger role than he did, but like there are plenty of guys you just mentioned and talked about that were more locked in than some of the other rookies and such that were there. I think that getting rookie wide receivers is still a good idea. What I don't think is a good idea is going overboard with rookie wide receivers on the same team. And I also think that we need to be very cognizant when a rookie wide receiver in an undesirable situation who is not even an elite wide receiver, right? Not talking Brian Thomas. Look, Ladd McConkey to me wasn't like an elite prospect, but he was a solid, like my model liked Ladd McConkey similarly to Ricky Pearsall, right? And then below them a little bit was like Keon Coleman. And then below him was Jalen Polk. Okay. Now, Polk still graded okay because of teammate score and because of his draft capital. But Polk's ADP, and I remember talking about this with people because this was one of the rare W's that I had in best ball this year. His ADP, he was the one rookie wide receiver that was like significantly rising from the latter parts of the late rounds to like into the 10th round, like, into that 11th round range, where that didn't make much sense. Like those are the landmines that I'm going to be very cognizant and weary of moving forward. Whereas, Ladd McConkey, who I wish I got more of, I wasn't for or against him really. But Ladd McConkey at least had the situation in his favor, right? Like we knew that there wasn't much competition at wide receiver, that he had Justin Herbert. Jalen Polk, not much competition at wide receiver, Jacoby Brissett, and an unknown in Drake May, right? Brian Thomas, some might be saying, well, what about Brian Thomas? Why were you on Brian Thomas? Because he was an elite prospect, like a really, really, really good prospect. He had a 95 score in my prospect model, in the ZAP model, which told me, guys in that range have hit very, very well. And then Rome Odunze doesn't hit. Well, he has situationally, it's not there for him. It's really not there for him. So, and I think that, if injuries would have happened, or, I think a lot of things just went south individually for the Bears offense in general for Rome not to hit. But I do think that like, picking and choosing and being a little bit more aware and smart about, not just getting like Javon Baker because I'm going to get the next Puka Nacua or something like that, I think is important, right? And I think that you can also kind of make up for it in August when we get more information. If you're drafting in May and June, I don't think going heavily after those players is as necessary, because the jump that we see in ADP, even if they are getting hyped, is only going to be 2 or 3 rounds. It's not, and that's in the late rounds, right? It's just not significant enough for you to like want to invest that early on. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some of the pros who end up listening to this will say, I disagree, but I do think that we can kind of play the middle a little bit better with the rookie wide receivers.
That's a great point about August too, because that's a time where not only are we seeing preseason action, but we're also getting the intra-squad reports as well. And if guys aren't getting burned, then week one, they're probably not going to get burned at that point. And like you said, if we're cashing in on 2 rounds of being ahead of market from 12 to 10, like that's not the type of EV that is going to be meaningful. Whereas like a running back injury, for example, that somebody that you were drafting in the middle rounds and then their counterpart gets hurt and all of a sudden they're going in the 3rd, 4th round. Like that's real EV that you've pocketed. But yeah, some sort of like double digit round 3rd string receiver EV, I don't think that's very meaningful whatsoever.
Yeah, now that I experienced the whole summer of Max entering and then going through all this too, I think that the one piece that I'll probably emphasize a lot next year is, and this is anecdotal, right? So like someone's definitely done this analysis, but this is me spewing this. And again, this is why I love becoming a best ball bro, because I can just talk and say things and people aren't going to sit there and wait for me to like have a strong take that's baked in analysis and stuff, because I'm just learning this stuff as everyone else is.
Meanwhile, people are listening to you and winning 6 figures.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Meanwhile, Coop goes out and wins $240K. Really cool. And I'm getting 2K in a big board contest.
Yeah.
So the one thing though that I want to say about like the gains that you get in ADP, this is Best Ball Mania specific, and I did worse in Best Ball Mania than basically every other contest that I entered, aside from like I didn't do well in the marathon. But I didn't have many entries and stuff. In the sprint, I didn't do very well in. But it's a different kind of game. But with BBM, you're drafting in May through August, right? And you have to, the benefit of drafting in May is that you get ADP discounts, right? And what I found, at least anecdotally, is I would imagine the ADP discounts that you get are going to be a lot more lucrative at the running back position than the wide receiver position. Because we know that running backs can jump up if a guy gets hurt, if we just get some reports that, look what happened to Chase Brown, right? Chase Brown rose like 3 rounds at one point because we got word that, they really liked him and he was crushing camp and all this kind of stuff. And so I do think that we should probably have our stances early on running backs only and not really worry about what the only guy that had a crazy rise at wide receiver, I would imagine, was Rashee Rice, and had nothing to do with anything football related, right? Again, this is more anecdotal. There's probably a wide receiver I'm not thinking of, but I would imagine that the running back position is the one that sees the biggest jump and gives you the biggest edge if you're able to sort of see things before they happen, early on in the draft process versus like in August and stuff.
Let's talk about some things that went right. We just went mad negative. Yeah,
but I know we
didn't
did
miss everything, JJ.
I didn't miss everything. Thank God. It would have been real bad. Like, look, Brian Thomas is one of my favorite players in football right now because he was my MVP on the Fantasy Footballer show this year. I went on and, going on the biggest podcast in the fantasy football space and putting yourself out there and having arguably the best value in fantasy football being Brian Thomas. I'm very, very happy about that. Very, very happy about Brian Thomas. And the reason for that is I do think there are, the stuff that I talked about a season long, not converting to best ball. Some stuff still converts. Ambiguous backfields, I think, still generally convert. You want to target running backs in backfields that are more ambiguous, that we don't know who the starter is, but there's multiple running backs going in those like mid to late rounds who are on the same team together, which is what we saw with Cincinnati this year. We saw it with Pittsburgh to a degree with Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. It's just that Jaylen Warren was banged up for most of the season. I think he just had more upside as like a player than Najee Harris did, even though I had more Najee Harris than Warren. But then we saw it with Tennessee too, where an injury can happen and Tony Pollard ends up being, a really good value from that perspective too. Whereas on the flip side, 2 of my biggest fades at running back this year were Zamir White, who, my God, the easiest fade, in my opinion. I'm not trying to trash anyone who was on him because I got stuff wrong too. But from my processes standpoint, that was one of the easiest fades in fantasy football history was Zamir White this year. It was you guys, I get feedback all the time where people are like, you're not bold enough with your stances or whatever. You heard me be bold with Zamir White, and you heard me also be bold with Ramondre Stevenson, who had his moments, but overall a pretty down year for him versus where you were drafting Stevenson. So the ambiguous backfield thing and why those kinds of archetypes are guys that you want to avoid is because they're projected to get all the work in their backfield. Yeah, Antonio Gibson was there. Yeah, Alexander Madison was there, but people saw them, Zamir White and Ramondre Stevenson, as bell cow backs. So then you have to ask yourself, why are they going in the middle rounds? Why aren't teams drafting them where Josh Jacobs is going? And the answer to that is because they're not very good. They're not nearly as good as Josh Jacobs and some of the other guys who were going earlier, right? And when you're not that good, there's an opportunity for other backs, or the situation's bad, but there's an opportunity for other backs to step in, which is what we saw in Vegas, and even to some degree with Antonio Gibson getting run with Ramondre Stevenson in New England. So that was good. I talked about the elite rookie wide receivers. I think that we need to always focus on that. Even Xavier Worthy had, a decent, had some spike ceilings down the stretch. Xavier Worthy's rookie season kind of went the way that a lot of solid rookie wide receivers, it's kind of the way that those seasons go, right? Starts out slow, a lot of boneheaded plays, a lot of questionable plays, but brought it together and was really productive down the stretch. So, I think Worthy at the end of the day was not a bad process pick at all. And then the last thing is these concepts translating from season long to best ball, the pocket passer trap, right? Where we don't want to get early round pocket passers who don't have that much mobility to their profiles. We even saw it with Mahomes to a degree. I mean, I know that he gets a little bit more rushing juice than some of these guys, but Mahomes was one. CJ Stroud, the only guy that you were not disappointed with that you drafted in the single digit rounds who was not mobile was Joe Burrow. And that took an elitely bad defense, right, from Cincinnati. And also Joe Burrow playing out of his freaking mind all year long, or I guess after the first 4 games of the season. Not to say that I do think that mobile quarterbacks in best ball are still a little bit overvalued, because when you look at the week to week fluctuations at quarterback, pocket passers are still giving you ceiling games. That's not the thing. It's more so that pocket passers are just generally more replaceable. You can get Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, those kinds of guys will step up. And we see this every year. Even Jared Goff, when he would fall in drafts, we see this every year where those pocket passers really can match the production of some of the earlier round pocket passers.
Yeah, it's taken folks a while to get around to it, but running quarterbacks, the rushing is the floor. The passing will always be the upside. But I mean, Jaden Daniels was that dude this year of teams that finished top 10 in the finals. He was on 6 of the teams, including team number 2 and team number 3. But that's because he was an incredible passer.
Exactly.
On top of running the ball. I believe he finished 4th or 5th in EPA per play. He was an absolute monster.
Yeah, exactly. Like we need that to happen. And same with Bo Nix. Bo Nix had a good floor with his rushing, but he ended up surprising everyone, and he had a really, really solid passing season, and he's good, right? And so that's definitely, something to keep in mind, is that the mobility is good. It can help ceiling too, because obviously, you're getting more points for that, but you still need the passing numbers to be there for these guys to hit a true ceiling. Go look at what Terrell Pryor does, or look at when Justin Fields has his spiked weeks, what's going on in those weeks. It's not that he's only running the football over and over again. It's that he ends up rushing for a touchdown and then throwing for 2. It's that he has the combination of scoring touchdowns. You just won touchdowns, period, at the quarterback position. 2 more things I just want to, they're kind of, or I guess 3, but they're all game theory driven in general. One thing that I think we did right, or at least I did, but I'm thinking that you probably did as well because we were drafting pretty similarly, is just general team balancing. If you get a quarterback early, you don't need to get another quarterback early with them. I don't think that's a way that I'm going to differentiate per se. When I talked about team structure, I do think that balancing is still really important, where the amount of draft capital you spend at a position, don't get 3 elite tight ends. It doesn't make any sense. If you're going to get 3 tight ends, get them late. I also think that, this is something that Pete Overzet drives into people's heads a lot, is focus. Yes, we focus on weeks 1 to 14, of course, but still only 25% of the pie here, right? Perfect example is what happened with me and BBM. The number of semifinal teams that I had was just as high as teams that had double the amount of playoff teams as I did, and advanced teams. So, just remember that, 25% of your season is weeks 1 to 14, despite that being such a large chunk in terms of time. And then the last point to make is that stacking is indeed important.
It's almost like many moons ago, we knew that Lions, Niners, and Packers, Vikings were going to be absolute fireworks this place.
Yeah. I mean, oh my gosh, the 49ers Lions game, that was it just felt like every time each team had the ball, they were going to score a touchdown. It was unbelievable. Like if you have exposure to those games, it's important. So I don't think this year showed us that week 17 stacking is a bad idea. Obviously you got to kind of just get a little lucky and have the right combinations and stuff. But I think that we are still going to continue memorizing that week 17 schedule every year.
Got that right. I'm waiting for the second Tuesday of March, whenever the NFL releases the schedule.
Yes, exactly. All right. Last thing I want to get to, Rich, what are your thoughts as someone who comes from the poker space? You've been involved in different tournaments and stuff like that, and just knowing how some of that stuff is structured. What are your thoughts, just some parting thoughts on what people have considered or what people have called pod luck, right? Where you end up scoring, in the semifinals, 190 points, but there just happens to be a team in your pod that scores 210 and they were impossible to beat. And now your 190 point team is out when another team scores 150 and they do advance because their pod sucked. Like what do you think that it's just a fun little characteristic of the game? Or do you think that people have the right to just be tilted over the whole experience?
Oh, definitely both. I'm going to steal a line from The Wire. It's all in the game, baby. Sometimes you're going to get an easy table draw with a bunch of guys on vacation that are just there to have fun and play poker and splash around. And sometimes you're going to be placed at a table with a bunch of people that are there to kill you and take every chip you have in front of you. And that's just part of the variance of this game. There's very few ways to jam hundreds of thousands of participants into a short playoff format that is going to be extremely well balanced. So I think that it's just variance that's part of the game. You and I were going back and forth on some alternative ways that perhaps maybe the playoffs could be structured. But I think whichever path you take, at some point to cram that many people through that narrow of a bottleneck is going to be some pain. And the 25% of the first 14 weeks only being 25%, I don't think people realize, because not everybody is able to experience the quarters, the semis, and even the finals, like the amount of variance in a 1 game, 1 week sample, and how painful that really is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's like if your goal is to have the least amount of variance and to not have tilting things that don't go your way. It's the same thing in season long. We deal with this in season long every single year. And look, I'm guilty of it. I tilt, like I get frustrated whenever, I have a team that should have gotten a bye in a league that I'm in, right? And but the reason it didn't is because there's divisions. And the other team...
No, not divisions. Yeah. Not divisions in 2024.
There's 2 divisions. My team gets 3rd because I didn't win my division because the top team in the league just happened to be in my division. And then I lost the first round of the playoffs, right? And then my team goes absolutely nuclear in week 16 and 17. Right.
Yeah, so I would have won the championship. You can't do the accounting. Once you're eliminated, I made this mistake in a league where I had a Jonathan Taylor team where Jonathan Taylor dropped the ball. Yeah. I had to follow that team. And of course I would have won the championship, but that's why you can't follow it. You just gotta close that team off forever.
Literally scored the most points in the league in 16 and 17 and then had that terrible beat week 15. Regardless, I take that and I internalize it and I get angry, because I'm a human being, but also it's just part of the fun of the game. It's not like a super high stakes league. I'm not like that upset about it, but, I think that's one thing that like you have to just be cognizant and recognize entering a tournament is like, what are these rules? And that's why Underdog, I think, did an even better job this year than they did the previous year. And they continue to improve, giving alternatives to what this experience is. You could do the marathon where it is a full season thing. You could do the sprint where it is a 3-week playoff. Like there are other ways to play this game that still have really good payouts if like that's what your goal is, as opposed to playing sort of like the flagship contest that they have. I enjoy BBM because and this is my overall kind of takeaway experience, wrap this thing up kind of take. I had a lot of fun doing this on a lot of different levels. Like there was obviously doing this with you, Rich, and, documenting all of this and like being able to chat with you every week. And there was also the talking to different guests and all of that. But the best ball community is just like the people who are playing this and playing tens of thousands of dollars are incredibly inviting, and they're incredibly open to this show and me going through this experience and becoming a best ball bro the way that I have, and also just like Coop, right? Just the average Joe who is playing best ball because they listen to a podcast that got them interested in doing it, and he's $240,000 richer because of it, right? And I'm not sitting here saying to you guys, hey, if you play Best Ball Mania, you too can win $240,000. What I'm saying is this contest is built to have those really, really big fun days, right? And that's what a lot of these contests are built like. You're going to more than likely, it's just like your fantasy league, or it's just like the NFL. Only 1 out of 32 teams is going to be happy at the end of the year, right? If that's not you, it's not going to be you. It's not your year. That's fine. I think that you have to embrace the experience of this all. You don't have to do what I did and max enter 150 entries in a $25 tournament and then play other entries and spend tons and tons of money. You can literally enter dollar entry tournaments, spend $100 during the summer and just experience this as well. And that to me is what this has showed me the most, is that there is this giant space out there of people who are nerdy and enjoy this stuff and are rooting for each other. And it's not just about like, getting that dub. It's about rooting for friends who are about to get that dub. It's about like our Discord, the night that Coop was sweating the Jahmyr Gibbs stuff, was out of control. And it was so much fun, right? Like this is one of the few games where we can really rally behind each other, because we don't have this with our season long leagues generally, right? Season long leagues, you're doing it in a silo a little bit. I don't think the experience is out there outside of best ball the way that it is. I mean, DFS has sweats and stuff, but it's different because best ball is like the 4-month wait of it all, not just that day.
There's the anticipation and the building to it. Yeah. It reminds me so much of where online poker was in like the mid 2000s. So they would have these tournaments. The Atlantis, the PokerStars Caribbean Adventure was one of the more famous ones in the Atlantis, in the Bahamas. And on Sundays, which were the big online poker days, everyone would just be in the lobby of the hotel, like grinding online. And one of the big tournaments, like obviously people would bust, and then there would just be crowds that would get around like the few people that were still remaining. And they were just like people drinking and celebrating. And like, it's that group sweat is just something that it's hard to replicate. And it's super fun.
It's super fun. And it's really easy to be like, oh man, like I could have been that person, but I had bad pod luck. And I get it. I understand that. But like, it's one of those things where you gotta understand what you're getting into and what you're doing. And this is a game that you can definitely have an edge. We have seen consistently people like Liam, who was on the show earlier this summer, a Leone, right? These guys are consistently doing well in not just BBM, but just in best ball in general. Like there are tons and tons of edges to be had, right? To increase your probability. But at the end of the day, it doesn't guarantee you anything, Like I'm not trying to throw Leone under the bus. He had an unbelievable advance rate. He got a little unlucky, didn't have a finals team, and like that sucks. And he knows that it sucks. But at the same time, that's what this game is about. It's just, there's going to be those times. There's also going to be those times where it goes the opposite direction. So that's my general parting thoughts with all of this, is that, I would rate my season a 4 out of 10. It was not the result that I necessarily like wanted. I got a cool sweat with the big board stuff. That was fun. But at the end of the day, I think that this is like bigger than just that. It's about everyone having the opportunity to do this thing and to experience this thing. How many people are like sending me screenshots and like sending me, it's amazing. It's so much fun. Right. And I think that at the end of the day is like what this is truly all about.
Run it back?
Oh my gosh. I guess so. Yeah, that'll be the last Becoming a Best Ball Bro episode of the 2024-2025 season. But maybe there will be something in the 2025-2026 season. Rich, I appreciate your time as always. Let everyone know where they can find you if they want to yell at you and not just me about how their best ball season went.
Yeah, at Rich T. Ryan. I'm in the Discord as well as Rich T. Ryan, and we're over on at Gridiron Gamble getting ready for the playoffs. I'm very happy the playoffs are here. The last couple of weeks of the season were an absolute slog, but really excited for these games coming up now.
Yeah, me too. And like I said, check out the underdog contests. I've been trying to throw some entries into the mitten. It's $5 entry, only 10 rounds, 6 teams. It goes really fast. So you can get a lot of lineups out there. Check that out. Promo code late round. Otherwise, everyone, as usual, thanks for tuning in.